What if the girl everyone feared was never the real danger at all? They called her cursed. They whispered that anyone who touched her would fall. And for years, Elowen believed them. At every gathering, she stood alone, avoided, judged, and treated like a living disaster waiting to happen. But the night the Alpha King entered the ballroom, something changed. While everyone else stepped back, he did the one thing no one had ever dared to do. He walked straight toward her. And with that single choice, he began to unravel a secret buried deeper than fear, older than lies, and powerful enough to threaten an entire kingdom. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. The Thornwood estate had built its reputation on beauty and control. On nights like this, the Great Hall did not simply host a ball. It performed one. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above a marble floor polished until it could have been a sheet of winter lake ice. Candlelight and lamplight mingled into something honeyed and warm, but the warmth never truly reached the corners. It only made the cold look expensive. Silk skirts whispered secrets over stone. Perfume drifted in pale ribbons, rose, amber, spice, citrus, sweet enough to make the air feel heavy. And everywhere, there were eyes. Eyes that measured. Eyes that ranked. Eyes that decided within a single glance who mattered. At the center of the waltz, the world looked flawless. Noble daughters in jewel-toned gowns spun in careful arcs. Laughter timed to music the way good manners were timed to power. Lords smiled with teeth and held their cups like trophies. Every movement had a purpose. Every pause was a signal. And at the far rim of that carefully choreographed perfection, where the candlelight thinned and conversation softened to a hush, there was an empty space, an absence shaped like fear. Elowen Thornvale stood inside that gap, as if the hall had formed around her, and then refused to close. She did not dance, she did not mingle, she did not lean toward anyone, even casually the way lonely people sometimes do when they try to look less alone. She stood with her hands folded neatly at her waist, spine-straight expression, composed, almost serene if you did not look closely. If you did not see the tension in her fingers, the way her shoulders held themselves, as if bracing for impact. If you did not notice how her eyes never lingered on any face for too long. She wore a dress that tried to be modest and failed not because it was indecent, but because it was too plain for this hall. Dove gray fabric, clean and simple with no glittering embroidery, no jeweled clasp, no trailing train meant to announce importance. The dress fit her well, which only made its simplicity more obvious. In a sea of peacock splendor, she looked like a candle that refused to burn bright. A crack in a mirror. The waltz swelled. Couples rotated. A chorus of soft voices rose and fell with the music. And then, like a stone dropped into still water, a laugh cut through the elegance. Is it true? The voice was young and loud and drunk enough to believe courage could be borrowed from wine. A nobleman no more than 20, with a sharp jaw softened by alcohol and a sash that announced his family name with ridiculous pride, stepped out of the crowd. His friends hung back, smirking, delighted by the prospect of spectacle. Not one of them reached for his sleeve. Not one of them stopped him. Elowen's gaze found him. It didn't sharpen. It didn't flare. It simply settled, weary and attentive, as if she had been waiting for this to happen all night. The young man swayed slightly, grinning too wide. They say you kill anyone who touches you. He called, turning just enough so that a cluster of nearby nobles could hear. Is that what you do? Do you curse them? What is it, rot their blood? A few heads turned, a few lips parted in anticipation. An old countess raised her fan and hid a smile behind lace. Elowen did not move. She did not back away, but her voice when it came was low and urgent, too quiet for the audience he wanted. Don't. The young man laughed. Don't. He took another step. Oh, come now, it's just a touch. Elowen's eyes flicked briefly toward his hand, then back to his face. Please, she said. And the word sounded like it had been scraped out of her throat. Don't come closer. Something in the air shifted at that. Something not magical, not yet just human. A ripple of discomfort that passed through those who heard the plea and recognized it for what it was, not an act, a warning. But the young nobleman was already committed. Pride was a trap, and the hall was full of people who loved to watch someone fall into one. He reached out. Elowen's fingers curled tighter into her own palm. Her breathing stilled as if she had learned long ago that even air could provoke disaster. His fingertips brushed her wrist. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The music kept playing. The chandeliers kept glittering. Somewhere someone tried to laugh again, uncertain. Then the young man's body jerked as if a wire had snapped inside him. His grin vanished. His eyes rolled white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a sharp, wet gasp. He convulsed, hard, violently. His knees buckled. His arms flailed once, catching nothing. And then he crashed to the marble floor with a sound that did not belong in a ballroom, a sickening, heavy sound. The waltz fractured. The orchestra faltered bows, stuttering against strings. A violinist made a strangled noise, as if she'd swallowed her breath. A scream rose high and bright, and then another. Glasses shattered. A goblet hit the floor and burst into red wine like a small, sudden wound. The crowd surged back as one creature retreating in a coordinated panic, skirts snapping, boots scraping. People collided, grasped at each other, and still no one moved toward Elowen. The space around her widened. It became a ring, a quarantine. Elowen stood with her wrist still slightly raised, as if she could not decide whether to lower her arm or keep it exactly where it was. Her face remained frighteningly calm. Not because she wasn't feeling anything, because she had learned that if she moved too fast, people died. Whispers broke loose like birds startled from a tree. "Stay away from her," she's cursed. "I told you she did it again." Elowen, Elowen, thorn of veil, wicked blood, monster. Elowen's gaze dropped to the young man on the floor. He lay twisted on his side, eyes fluttering, lips blue-tinged as he fought for air. Someone shouted for healers, but the healers hesitated at the edge of the ring, looking from the fallen nobleman to Elowen with fear in their eyes. Elowen's throat tightened. Her hand remained where it was, as if she lowered it, something worse might leap out of her skin. She didn't remember when she learned to stand so still during catastrophes. She didn't remember the first time she watched someone collapse after touching her. The early memories had blurred together over the years into the same cold shape, someone close, then suddenly not. Someone alive, then suddenly gone. A room full of people backing away as if she carried plague in her breath. But she remembered the feeling, the sharp, sick certainty that rose in her chest every time. It's me. It's always me. Her fingers tightened against her palm, and she whispered the words without meaning to. Not for the crowd, not for anyone else, for herself. It's me. Her voice barely existed. It's always me. She did not cry. She did not break down. Panic would have been almost merciful. Panic would have made her human. But Elowen had spent too many years learning how to lock her emotions behind stone. Her fear was quieter now, familiar, a thin wire stretched inside her. Don't let anyone come close. Don't let anyone touch you. Don't give the thing inside you a reason to wake. She didn't have words for that last thought, not yet, not consciously, but the instinct lived in her bones. Around the ring, the nobles murmured, as if watching a storm from behind glass. A woman in emerald satin yanked her teenage daughter backward, by the elbow, voice tight and sharp. "Don't look at her." Her daughter tried anyway, curiosity shining, but the mother's grip tightened. "She brings misfortune," the woman hissed, and the words landed like stones. Elowen turned her head a fraction away, not because the insult hurt. She had collected worse like bruises, but because she was used to making herself smaller, used to stepping out of the story other people wanted to tell about her. At the far side of the hall, the Thornavale family stood clustered together as if distance could protect them from association. Lady Seraphine Thornavale maintained her smile. It was a perfect smile, the kind practiced in mirrors and refined in drawing rooms, warm enough to seem concerned, polite enough to appear composed, but her eyes were colder than the marble floor. Lord Valric Thornavale did not approach his daughter. He did not speak her name. He made a small gesture to a servant, two fingers flicking outward in order to handle the mess, to remove the stain, to restore the illusion. Lysara, Elowen's older sister, stepped forward just far enough to be seen, but not far enough to risk closeness. She looked at Elowen as if at a crack in a vase that had been displayed too long. "You never learn, do you?" Lysara said, voice pitched, low, razor-sharp. Elowen didn't answer. Lysara's lips curved slightly. She raised her voice just a touch enough that nearby nobles would hear. "You should have stayed hidden," she continued, and the word hidden tasted like triumph in her mouth. Still, Elowen remained silent. That silence was a weapon Lysara didn't know how to use, and it irritated her. She tipped her chin and spoke louder, letting cruelty bloom for an audience. "This is why no one wants you," she said. "You ruin everything just by standing there." A few small laughs answered her. Not loud, not bold, but sharp enough to cut. Elowen's posture did not change. Her face did not shift. Only her fingers curled tighter, nails pressing crescents into her skin. Lord Vaelric finally spoke not to Elowen, but to the servant closest to him. "Take her away after this," he said, eyes fixed on the fallen nobleman rather than his daughter. "We've made our point. We've made our point." As if Elowen were a warning sign. As if her existence were an argument. Elowen heard him. Of course she did. And the strangest thing was that the words did not surprise her. They did not even shock her. They slid into place alongside every other quiet cruelty she had lived under for years, denials delivered, with calm voices, punishments inflicted with clean hands. She had learned long ago that pain did not always come with shouting. Sometimes it came with the absence of care. The healers finally darted forward, hands glowing with pale magic, as they knelt beside the young nobleman. They worked quickly, murmuring prayers and diagnostics, trying to stabilize his breath. They did not touch Elowen. They did not even look at her. As the hall began to recover from its initial shock, whispers shifting from terror into hungry speculation, another kind of emptiness held steady on the opposite side of the room. Not fear, power, a stretch of space existed there too, a respectful distance that no one dared cross without invitation. Kalen Draxer stood within it. He was taller than most men in the hall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black so deep it seemed to drink the candlelight rather than reflect it. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that looked carved from stone, an old battle's sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and a faint scar tracing a pale crescent at his left temple. But it was his eyes that made the room bend around him. Pale. Ice caught in moonlight. Not blue, not silver, something in between, cold enough to make people lower their gaze without thinking. He had been introduced earlier, of course. The entire hall had shifted when he arrived. Noble daughters had lined up in careful, hopeful order. Each one perfect, each one bred and trained to please a king. He had refused them all. 17 noble daughters. 17 polite rejections delivered with a single word. No. A high-ranking advisor had tried again minutes ago, voice sweet and cautious. "Your Majesty, perhaps the daughter of House Kalen hadn't even looked at him." No, he'd said low and final. He did not play their games. He did not pretend. He did not soften. He was Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, ruler of territories that stretched from the Frost Mountains to the ember-bright coastal cities. A man who commanded armies and ended rebellions with cold precision. A crown that did not sparkle, it burned. And yet until this moment he had looked bored, as if the entire ballroom were a tedious obligation. The commotion across the hall reached him like a wave. He turned his head. At first his gaze landed on the fallen noblemen, the ring of frightened bodies, the healers. He saw what they wanted him to see, the cursed girl, the danger. Then his eyes found Elowen. Something subtle changed in his posture, not softened, not warmed, sharpened. His gaze narrowed, not with suspicion, but with focus, as if something in him had recognized a pattern that didn't match the story being told. He watched the way she stood still, as stone, not triumphant, not cruel. Watched the way her hand remained half raised as if she were afraid to move it. Watched the tightness around her mouth, the restraint in her breathing. That's not how a monster stands. A thought flickered through him, quick and clear. And then another quieter thought followed. That's how someone stands when they're trying to keep things from getting worse. Elowen felt the shift before she saw him. She didn't know how she knew. She only felt the air change as if pressure had altered somewhere behind her ribs. A strange warmth began to bloom beneath her sternum, small at first like the first spark of a fire. It spread slow and steady. Not pain, not fear, something else. Something that felt like anticipation, like a thread pulling taut in darkness. Elowen's eyes lifted. Across the room, through the haze of candlelight and bodies, a man was watching her. Not watching. Seeing. The difference hit her with the force of a blow. Her breath caught. The warmth in her chest tightened, drawing her attention to him, as if something inside her had turned its face toward his presence. He was wrong for this room. Too still, too powerful, not glittering, not charming, a shadow given form. And he was looking at her as if she were the only real thing in the ballroom. Elowen's instincts screamed. Not to run running would only draw attention. Not to hide, there was nowhere to hide, but to protect, to keep him away. Because he was looking at her with the kind of gaze that led people to do foolish things. Elowen felt horribly that he might do one. A nobleman near Kaelin noticed the direction of the king's gaze and stiffened. His eyes widened. "Your Majesty, no," he blurted, voice cracking. "Stay away from her." Another voice joined, urgent, panicked. "She's cursed. Anyone who touches her." Kaelin didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge them. His eyes stayed locked on Elowen. "Is that so?" he said softly. The question wasn't skeptical in the way a courtier might ask to humiliate someone. It was curious, as if he genuinely wanted to know. Elowen shook her head, a tiny motion no one else would have caught. "Don't," she breathed. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. The crowd began to fall back again, not just from Elowen now, but from the space between her and Kaelin, as if they could feel what was about to happen and wanted no part of it. A path opened across the marble floor. No one spoke. No one laughed. The orchestra, uncertain, held the final note of the broken waltz and then let it fade into silence. Kaelin took one step. The sound of his boot against marble landed like a drumbeat. An advisor reached out, hand hovering near his sleeve, and then pulling back as if even touching the king without permission might be fatal. "Your Majesty, please, this is not wise," the man whispered. Kaelin didn't stop. He walked, not fast, not dramatic, not in a rush. Charming men strutted. Warriors marched. Kaelin moved with the calm certainty of someone who had never needed permission to cross a room. Elowen stood frozen against the pillar. The warmth in her chest tightened until it felt like a string being drawn between them. 10 steps. 7. 5. The entire ballroom held its breath, and Kaelin Draxer kept coming. He stopped only when he stood close enough that Elowen could see the silver vein threading through his irises. Close enough that she could smell him cold smoke and something wild under it, the scent of winter forests and iron. He did not look at the fallen nobleman. He did not look at the healers. He looked at Elowen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hall seemed to shrink, the crowd fading into peripheral blur. The warmth in Elowen's chest flared a bright, terrifying pulse. Her skin prickled. The fine hairs on her arms rose. She pressed her back harder against the pillar, not because she wanted distance from Kaelin, but because her body needed something solid to anchor to. Kaelin's gaze dropped briefly to her wrist, still half raised. He noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. Then he lifted his eyes again. "Do you believe them?" he asked. Elowen blinked. The question struck her like a stone thrown into water. Not, "What are you?" Not, "Are you dangerous?" Not, "Did you do that? Do you believe them?" She swallowed, throat dry. "It doesn't matter what I believe." Kaelin tilted his head slightly. "It matters to me." Elowen's mouth opened, then closed. Words tangled in her chest. She forced herself to speak, voice quiet and strained. "People get hurt," she said. "Every time someone gets too close, something happens." Kaelin's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "And you think you're the cause?" Elowen didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. Kaelin took a half step closer. Elowen's breath hitched. Panic flashed through her. Sharp and immediate. "Don't," she said louder now. "I'm warning you." The words were true, but the emotion behind them was what mattered. It wasn't the fear of someone about to be exposed, it was the fear of someone about to watch another person fall because of her. Kalen saw it. He saw it the way he had seen battlefields quickly, precisely without being fooled by surface noise. This is not the fear of a predator, he thought. This is the fear of someone who has been blamed for storms she never summoned. Behind Kalen, the crowd murmured restless, "Your Majesty, she'll kill you." No one survives her touch. Elowen's eyes flicked to the fallen nobleman still struggling on the floor, Healer's hands glowing as they worked. Her stomach twisted. She had tried to stop it. She always tried. Kalen lifted his hand. The movement was slow, deliberately slow. Not to taunt her, but to show her that he wasn't going to lunge, that she had time to pull away. Elowen shook her head, dread rising like cold water. "If you do this," her voice broke, "I can't stop it." Kalen's eyes didn't waver. "Then don't," he said softly. And he touched her. His fingers closed around her wrist, not tight, not bruising, firm enough to be real. The hall stopped existing. Elowen's blood turned to ice. She waited for the familiar horror, for the snap of catastrophe, for Kalen's body to stiffen, for his eyes to roll back, for him to collapse at her feet like everyone else. A heartbeat passed. 2. Nothing happened. No scream, no convulsion, no death. Kalen remained standing, his grip steady. A shocked whisper rippled through the crowd. "He's still standing." She didn't hurt him. "That's impossible." A noblewoman's voice shook, barely audible. "Why? Why isn't anything happening?" Elowen stared at Kalen's hand on her skin as if she could not comprehend what she was seeing. This was the first time in her life someone had touched her without tragedy following immediately behind. The warmth in her chest surged, not like a disease, like recognition, a flicker of light so faint she might have imagined it glimmered at the edge of her vision. Gold thin as thread there and gone. Elowen gasped, a sharp inhale she couldn't control. Kalen's fingers tightened a fraction, not possessive anchoring. He felt it too. He knew it by the way the air shifted, by the way something in his own chest answered hers like a pulse echoing back. The marble floor beneath them trembled so subtle most didn't notice, but Kalen's instincts did. A cinder of power slid along his skin, a connection, a bond, not one forged by ceremony, not one arranged by politics, something older. A guard at the edge of the hall stiffened, face draining of color. "Your Majesty," he murmured. "Something is reacting." Elowen's breath turned shallow. "This isn't supposed to happen," she whispered, and there was awe in her voice laced with terror. Kalen leaned slightly closer, only enough for his words to reach her and no one else. "Neither is what they told you," he said. The faint golden flicker vanished as quickly as it came, but the aftertaste remained an electric hum beneath Elowen's skin. The crowd began to break apart into frantic, overlapping theories. Maybe she's not cursed, or worse, if he's immune or she's only dangerous to lesser blood. Lady Seraphine's smile faltered for the first time, her fingers curling around the fabric of her sleeve as if she needed something to hold. Lord Valric's gaze snapped to Elowen, sharp with alarm, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Lysara's face whitened. Her lips parted, and she whispered, not with triumph now, but with panic. "No, that's not how this works." Kalen didn't look at her. He didn't look at any of them. He was watching Elowen. "You warned me," he said quietly. "You tried to stop me." Elowen's throat tightened. "Because I didn't want you to end up like them." Kalen's eyes narrowed a fraction, thoughtful. Monsters don't warn their victims. Something in the story of Elowen Thornvale had been twisted until it fit the shape people wanted, until it justified their fear and their cruelty. Kalen felt anger rise cold and controlled, not for himself, but for the girl pinned against a pillar by the weight of everyone's terror. He released her wrist. Elowen flinched at the sudden absence, the loss of warmth like a door closing in winter. But Kalen didn't step away from her. He stepped in front of her. He turned so that his back faced Elowen and his gaze faced the hall. It was a simple movement, a rearrangement of bodies, and it changed everything. because it declared without needing a single word that anyone who wanted to reach Elowen would have to go through him first. A guard began to step forward. Your Majesty, we should secure the area. Kalen didn't turn his head. No one comes closer, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the way authority carries like steel on stone. The guard stopped immediately, so did everyone else. Elowen stood behind Kalen, stunned. She had spent her entire life being moved away, pushed behind curtains, hidden in corridors, shut into rooms, always as a precaution, always as a punishment. No one had ever placed themselves between her and the world like this. Not to hide her, to protect her. Kalen angled his head slightly enough that his words reached her. Walk, he said. Elowen didn't understand at first. Her body felt too heavy, her thoughts too scattered. Kalen repeated calm as the tide, with me. Elowen's instincts screamed that following him would be dangerous, that being seen beside him would bring consequences she couldn't survive, that her family would punish her, the court would tear her apart, the world would decide she didn't deserve whatever miracle this was. But another instinct, smaller, quieter, whispered something she had never allowed herself to consider. He isn't afraid. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that mattered more than any warning. Elowen swallowed. Then she stepped forward. The moment she moved, the hall seemed to tilt. Conversations stopped, faces turned. Some nobles bowed instinctively as Kalen passed. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, as if watching a myth walk through their perfect ballroom. Elowen kept her gaze down. She stayed close behind Kalen the way a person stays close to shelter in a storm. The ring of fear that had always surrounded her shifted. Not gone, but altered. Now it wasn't just her they feared. It was what it meant that the Alpha King had chosen to stand with her. They reached the great doors at the side of the hall doors Elowen had never been allowed to use. Kalen paused, hand on the iron handle. Elowen stood beside him, heart still off rhythm, her wrist tingling where his fingers had been. Kalen didn't turn fully toward her. He didn't make a display, he didn't soften his posture for the crowd. But his voice when he spoke was close only for her. You're not what they think. Elowen's breath caught. The words struck her somewhere deep, somewhere bruised. A simple sentence. And yet it cracked something in the world she'd built around herself. She stared at her hand, then at the door, then at the shadowed corridor beyond. She remembered the lack of catastrophe at his touch. No screaming, no death. Only that strange golden warmth, like a thread snapping taut. She whispered so quietly that if he'd been anyone else, he might not have heard. Then what am I? Kalen didn't answer immediately. He pulled the door open. Cooler air slid in from the corridor, carrying the scent of stone and night-blooming gardens. The brightness of the ballroom spilled outward like a tide, and for a heartbeat, Elowen stood on the threshold between two worlds, the gilded cruelty behind her and the unknown ahead. Kalen stepped through. First, then glanced back, not at the crowd, but at her. His gaze held hers steady and unafraid, and Elowen followed him into the corridor, carrying with her for the first time in her life a question more dangerous than any curse. What if they were wrong? The corridor beyond the ballroom doors felt like a different world. Behind them, the Thornavale Hall still glittered and trembled with gossip, a living creature made of silk and wine and fear. Ahead, the stone passage breathed cool air, smelling faintly of dust and iron and old paper secrets that had been shut away long enough to grow teeth. Elowen followed Kalen with steps that didn't feel like her own. Her wrist still held the ghost of his touch, warm and steady, as if the contact had left a mark deeper than skin. It should have terrified her. Instead, it made her chest ache with something she didn't have a name for. Kalen walked without hesitation, his black coat moving like shadow over stone. He did not speak as they moved through the narrow hallways, but Elowen could feel a shift in him, something honed, purposeful. Not the bored king from the ballroom, not the indifferent ruler who had dismissed noble daughters with a single word. This was the man who tracked truths the way wolves tracked blood. A half step behind Captain Rovan Hale followed with rigid caution. His hand stayed near the hilt of his sword, but his eyes were on Elowen, measuring her like an unknown weapon. Your Majesty, Rovan murmured as they passed a gilded archway into a darker wing of the estate. This is private ground? Kaelin didn't slow. It won't be private anymore. Elowen's throat tightened. She had never been led into this part of her own home. As a child, she'd been warned away with sharp voices. As a teenager with locked doors, as an adult with silent expectations, she had learned not to question. She had accepted that the estate contained spaces she did not belong in, rooms that existed only for others. Now Kaelin moved through those forbidden halls like the locks had never been invented. They reached a door that looked ordinary at first glance. Dark wood iron, hinges no crest, but the air around it carried weight. 2 old lanterns hung on either side, their flames small and stubborn, as if even light hesitated here. Rovan shifted. Your Majesty the Lord, Will Kaelin placed his hand on the handle and pushed. The door opened with a reluctant groan, exhaling cold air that tasted of ink and sealed wax. Inside was a records chamber. Shelves rose to the ceiling, lined with parchment-bound ledgers and scroll cases stacked in careful order. Dust lay in soft layers over everything, as if time had been allowed to settle undisturbed for years. Wax seals, burgundy and black, glimmered like dried blood on paper. A faint scent of old vellum and metal clasps hung in the air. Elowen stepped in and felt a chill run down her spine. I've never been allowed in here, she said before she could stop herself. Kaelin's gaze swept the room once, quick and sharp. That he replied is usually an invitation. He walked to the nearest shelf, dragging his fingers along the spine of a ledger. The dust clung to his skin like ash. He paused at a row marked with an old symbol, a wolf's head encircled by a thorn crown, but it was different from the one on his ring. Older, sharper, less polished, and there, half hidden behind a stack of scrolls, was a seal that had been scratched, clawed at, almost like someone had tried to ruin it without tearing the document open. Kaelin's eyes narrowed. This shouldn't be hidden, he said almost to himself. Elowen stood behind him, suddenly aware of her own breathing. The quiet in the room pressed at her ears. Kaelin lifted a scroll case, opened it with a twist of his wrist, and pulled out a tightly rolled parchment. He didn't hesitate. He broke the wax seal cleanly, as if he had done this his entire life. Maybe he had. His eyes moved across the lines, some written in modern script, some in older runes, and then he stopped. Elowen saw it in his face before she heard it, a sudden stillness, as if the words had struck him physically. He read aloud slowly, voice lowered. Ritual containment, blood-bound vessel. Elowen took a step forward. What does that mean? Kaelin didn't answer immediately. He stared at the page as if he wanted it to change into something else. His gaze darkened, and Elowen understood with cold clarity he had found something he hadn't wanted to find. He turned the parchment toward her. Most of the runes were unfamiliar, twisting ancient, the kind of writing that belonged in storybooks and chapel walls. But along the margins, someone had translated sections into plain language. Elowen's eyes caught on the first line and went numb. Subject designated as vessel. Containment must begin at birth. Seal integrity dependent upon emotional stability of host. Perceived threat triggers defensive reaction. Unauthorized intimacy prohibited. All contact discouraged. Fear recommended. Elowen's mouth went dry. The words swam on the parchment. No, she whispered. No, that's not. Kaelin cut, in voice low but unshakable. You're not cursed? The sentence hung in the air like a bell struck once and left ringing. Elowen stared at him, almost desperate. Then, why does everyone around me? Her voice broke. She couldn't finish the thought because finishing it would summon the images, bodies dropping eyes, rolling back screams, hands yanked away from her skin, as if touching her was contagious. Kaelin's jaw tightened. Because something inside you reacts. Elowen blinked, unable to understand. He paused as if choosing words carefully, then spoke again, clearer. You're not the source, he said. You're the container. The word container fell like a verdict. Elowen stumbled back a step, her shoulder brushing a shelf. Dust rained softly down. No. Kaylin took one step toward her, only one, and stopped, deliberately not touching her. They didn't fail to remove a curse, he said, voice roughening. They placed something inside you. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thick with old secrets and newer dread. A faint draft moved through the chamber, though the door was closed. The lantern flames flickered, bending as if something invisible had passed between them. Elowen's hands rose to her chest, fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress, as if she could stop her own heartbeat. Her voice was hollow. I'm holding it. Kaylin met her gaze, and there was no pity there. No soft lie, only truth. Yes. For a second, Elowen couldn't hear anything except the rushing in her ears. She had spent her entire life believing she was the storm. Now she was being told she was the sky that trapped it. A sharp sound footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, quick, purposeful, too controlled to belong to servants. Rovan straightened instantly, hand on his sword. The door swung open. Lady Seraphine stepped in her gown, immaculate, her hair pinned perfectly, her face wearing the careful expression of a woman who had never allowed panic to wrinkle her skin. Behind her came Lord Valric, Elowen's father, his posture rigid, his eyes flat. Their faces held no surprise, no confusion, only anger, and beneath it something like fear. You shouldn't have opened that, Seraphine said, voice cold enough to frost glass. Elowen turned slowly. For the first time in her life, she didn't lower her eyes. You knew, she said, it wasn't a question. Seraphine's lips pressed into a line. Valric's gaze flickered just once, the smallest crack. Silence. Then Valric exhaled through his nose as if he were tired. We did what was necessary, he said. Elowen gave a small laugh that sounded like something breaking. Necessary. Seraphine moved a half step forward but still kept distance, as if proximity might ignite consequences. If we had told anyone the truth, she said, voice smooth, measured, you would have been taken or killed. Her eyes moved to Kaylin for a fraction of a second and then back to Elowen. Fear was safer. Elowen's throat tightened. For who no one answered immediately. Kaylin did. His voice cut through the room like metal. You let her carry this alone. Valric's jaw flexed. We let her live. Elowen took a step back and felt nothing in her eyes. The tears were gone, not because she was strong, but because the emotion had drained out of her, leaving only a numb cavity. You let them hate me, she said softly. You let me believe I was the one hurting them. Seraphine's expression didn't soften. If anything, it became harder, like stone defending itself. It was the only way no one would come close, she said. A brutal truth delivered cleanly. They had turned her into a monster on purpose. Not because they believed she deserved it, because it was useful. Elowen's stomach turned. Her hands shook, but she didn't hide them. So all those years she whispered when I begged to know what was wrong with me? Her voice scraped. When I thought I was broken. Valric's eyes moved away. Some burdens, he said, are meant to be carried in silence. Elowen stared at him as if she had never truly seen him before. He wasn't even ashamed. Kaylin's gaze burned ice hot. You made her a cage, he said, and then punished her for rattling. Seraphine's chin lifted. You think you understand, she said, and there was an edge now, something defensive and proud. You think love can. Kaylin stepped closer, and the entire room seemed to contract around him. I understand this, he said quietly. You built a life around her suffering because it kept your secrets safe. Seraphine's eyes flashed. It kept the kingdom safe. Elowen flinched at the word kingdom because it made the suffering feel bigger, more justified, like her pain was merely a price in some grand ledger. Kaylin turned back to the parchment. He flipped to another section, reading, his voice controlled but vibrating beneath. The entity reacts to perceived threat. He read the next line aloud, slower, so Elowen could hear each word. When the host experiences fear or harm, the seal destabilizes briefly. Elowen's breath hitched. So when people got hurt, she whispered. Kaylin looked up. It wasn't you attacking them, he said. It was it reacting. Elowen's mind flashed with memories, bright, fragmented, cruel. A servant years ago bending down to lift her when she had fallen and scraped her knee. Elowen crying not from pain but from fear, because she had already learned fear had consequences. The servant's arms around her, warm, comforting. Then days later, the servant's body laid out, pale lips blue, everyone whispering as if Elowen had summoned death with a sob. Another memory, a child's hand tugging hers in the garden. Elowen laughing for the first time in weeks, then tripping over a root, panic flaring because she didn't want to be punished for falling. The child pulling her upright, close, close. And then that child vanishing into the night, never found, as if the earth had swallowed him. Her weakest moments, her most frightened, those were the moments disaster struck. Elowen's body trembled. I thought I was killing them, she breathed. Kalen shook his head once firm. You were trying to survive. The words should have been comfort. They weren't. Because survival meant the tragedies still happened. Survival meant she was still dangerous, just not by intention. Elowen's knees felt unsteady. She gripped the edge of a shelf. For the first time in her life, she was being told she wasn't evil, but the truth was worse in a different way, because it meant there really was something inside her, something that could kill. A voice spoke from the doorway, and now the seal is weakening. Everyone turned. A man stood in the hall's threshold as if he owned it. Tall, severe, dressed in dark ceremonial robes with silver runic embroidery at the cuffs. His hair was iron gray, pulled back tightly. His eyes were pale and flat like winter light on stone. Archon Malrek Virel, leader of the High Council, the kind of man who decided the fate of provinces over cups of tea. Rovin's sword slid halfway from its sheath with a rasp, his body angled subtly protective. Kalen didn't move. You've been watching, Kalen said. Malrek's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. We've been waiting. His gaze swept over Elowen as if she were furniture. Not a girl, not a person, an object. The vessel is unstable, he said. Containment will fail. Elowen's skin went cold. What are you saying? She asked, but her voice sounded far away even to herself. Malrek didn't hesitate. You will not survive this, he said, as if stating whether. And neither will the kingdom, if we do nothing. Kalen's head turned slowly. When he faced Malrek, his eyes looked like ice sharpened into blades. You're not doing anything, Kalen said. Malrek met his gaze without flinching. We are preventing a catastrophe. Elowen couldn't hear much after that. The words blurred into meaning, and the meaning formed into one heavy truth that dropped into her chest and settled there like lead. She wasn't just feared because of rumor. She was feared because she was real danger, not a curse of fate, a containment system that could fail, a living seal that might break. Elowen backed away a step, her mind racing in circles, trying to find a way out of the truth. This is what I am, a cage, a disaster waiting to happen. She turned her face away from them all, staring at the dusty shelf as if the old paper could offer her something steady. Then they were right to be afraid, she said quietly. Kalen moved toward her. No, don't Elowen cut him off sharper than she intended. Not this time. She faced him again, and her eyes were raw, stripped of illusion. If I lose control, people die, she said. That part was never wrong. Kalen's jaw tightened, pain flickering across his face like a shadow. But he didn't speak. Elowen closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them again, there was decision in her gaze, cold and clear. I can't stay. The words fell into the room like an object dropped from height. Silence followed. Even Malrek seemed to pause, the slightest shift in his eyes, as if he'd expected fear, not resolve. Kalen didn't command her to stop. He didn't reach for her wrist. He didn't use the crown to trap her. He simply said, if you walk out, I walk with you. Elowen froze. You don't understand, she whispered. This isn't something you can fight. Kalen answered immediately, voice steady. I'm not fighting it. He took a step closer, not touching, just near enough that she could feel his presence like heat. I'm choosing you. Behind them, Malrek let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Then you choose the end of your kingdom, he said. Kalen didn't even look at him. Then I rebuild it, Kalen replied. Simple, absolute. The words should have been impossible. No king spoke like that. No ruler shrugged at the idea of losing everything. But Kalen said it as if kingdoms were bricks, and he could lay them again with his own hands. Elowen's breath caught. For a moment, something in her chest, something fragile, tried to rise. Hope. And that was the cruelest twist of all. Because hope was what destabilized her. Hope was what made her heart pound and her emotions surge. Hope was dangerous. The air changed, not subtly this time. The temperature dropped sharply as if winter had stepped into the room. The lantern flames flickered, light stuttered. Elowen's body stiffened mid-breath. A sensation rose from inside her, something not her, something older than her bones. It moved upward like a tide pushing against the inside of her skin. She gasped, hand flying to her sternum. Kalen's head snapped up. Rovan went fully into guard stance sword, drawn with a clean hiss of steel. Malrek took a small step back, just one, but it was the first time he had moved away from her. Elowen's ears rang. And then inside her mind, a voice whispered, soft as breath on glass. They fear you because they feel me. Elowen's eyes widened. No. The floor beneath her feet trembled, not from footsteps, from pressure. Dark energy seeped out from her like ink bleeding into water. It wasn't an explosion. It was a leak, a containment failing at its edges. Elowen lifted her hands and saw faint threads of shadow curling around her fingers, laced with a pale, strange light like moonlight trapped in smoke. I can't stop it, she said, voice shaking. I can't. The shelves rattled. Scroll cases rolled off their ledges and clattered to the floor. Papers fluttered up as if caught by an invisible wind. Clear the room, Rovan barked, grabbing Seraphine by the arm and pulling her back before she could protest. Seraphine jerked free, eyes wide now, her composure cracking. Valric stood rigid, his face pale. He didn't move toward Elowen. He never did. Malrek's voice cut through the chaos, cold and satisfied. You see, he said, this is exactly why she cannot be allowed to exist. Elowen's throat tightened. The shadow around her thickened. The air pressed against her lungs as if the room wanted to squeeze her into silence. Stay back, she cried, voice breaking. All of you stay back. Another wave pushed out from her stronger. It slammed into the far wall, and a stone statue near the doorway cracked down its center with a sound like bone breaking. Elowen clutched her head nails, digging into her scalp. I can feel it, she gasped. It's pushing. Let me out. The voice inside her was clearer now, no longer whispering. Not screaming, either worse. Calm, hungry, certain. Elowen stumbled, nearly falling. Shadow and pale light swirled in her eyes, reflecting something that wasn't human, wasn't wolf. A moment of perfect horror passed through the room, everyone seeing finally that the fear had always been justified. Elowen's breath came in sharp bursts, her heart hammered. They were right. She whispered the words, tasting like poison. I am the danger. Kalen took a step toward her. No, he said. Elowen shook her head fiercely. Don't. The shadows surged again, curling toward him like a living thing. If you come closer, her voice fractured. I can't control it. I never could. Tears filled her eyes, not from weakness, but from the realization that understanding the truth didn't change the outcome. She could know she wasn't evil and still be lethal. She could be innocent and still be catastrophic. All this time she whispered, voice raw, they weren't wrong to fear me. I just didn't understand why. Her gaze locked onto Kalen's, and for the first time there was no hope there, only grief. If I stay, people will die. Kalen's face tightened as if those words were physically wounding him. A beat of silence. So I won't, Elowen said. She turned, intending to leave, to vanish into the night, to walk far away from every living thing and let the seal break where it could harm no one. But Kalen did not call guards. He did not order her restrained. He did not raise his voice and demand obedience. He stepped forward into the pressure. Rovan shouted, horrified, Your Majesty. No, Malrek's composure snapped for the first time. You'll destabilize it further. Kalen didn't stop. The force of the leaking power pressed into his chest like a storm wind. His coat snapped around him. The floor cracked beneath his boots. Dust lifted in spirals. Elowen whirled back, terror flooding her. Stop, she screamed. I said stay away. Kalen shook his head once. No. He stepped closer. The shadow reached for him, but it didn't strike. It tested, circling like a beast, sniffing a new presence. Kalen lifted his hand. No hesitation, no fear. And he touched Elowen. For a heartbeat, Elowen expected destruction. Instead, the world steadied. The pressure around her shuddered and then slowed. The shadow and pale light that had been writhing like combatants began to move in a different rhythm, less like war, more like breath. Elowen froze, her lungs locked. Kalen held her firmly, not tight but sure, like an anchor driven into earth. Look at me, he said, voice low and unwavering. Elowen didn't want to. If she looked, she might believe. If she believed, she might feel. If she felt the seal might fail. But Kalen's eyes were there, ice and steel and something else beneath. So she looked. You were never the curse, Kalen said. A beat. You were the shield. The words struck Elowen like sunlight through storm clouds. Not gentle, not warm, revealing. Elowen's mouth parted. No. If I was then why? Because no one told you the truth. Kalen cut in, and his voice roughened anger bleeding through his calm for the first time. Because it was easier to let you carry their fear than to carry their guilt. His grip didn't tighten into restraint. It held her as if he feared she would fall apart. You weren't destroying anything, he said. You were holding it back. Elowen trembled. Memories returned sharper now, aligning with the truth every time she had been frightened, every time she had been hurt, every time she had begged someone to stop, to step away. She hadn't been summoning catastrophe. She had been struggling to keep a catastrophe from escaping. I wasn't breaking, Elowen whispered. Her breath slowed, as if her body understood something her mind had refused for years. I was holding it together. Kalen nodded once. Yes. A single tear slid down Elowen's cheek. Not from pain, from understanding. She had never been the monster. She had been the cage, and if the cage shattered, the monster would finally be free. Elowen closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't try to push the power away. She didn't try to smother it, to deny it, to pretend she was ordinary. She listened. The darkness inside her wasn't only hunger, it was also strangely instinct. A force bound to the seal, reacting to threat, feeding on fear, pressing outward when it sensed weakness. But it could be spoken to, not with words, with calm, with choice. Kalen's hand remained on hers, not controlling, not commanding, just there. Breathe, he murmured. Elowen drew a shaky inhale, then another. Slow, deliberate. The swirling energy around them began to settle. The lantern flames steadied, rising back into clean shapes. The floor stopped trembling. The papers that had been lifted by invisible wind drifted down in soft spirals, landing like snow. The voice in her mind faded, no longer sharp. You contain me? Elowen opened her eyes. The room was quiet, not dead, not emptied by fear, just quiet. The storm was still inside her, but it was held. Kalen released a fraction of the tension in his shoulders. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He simply looked at her as if she were real. Roven kept his sword raised, but his expression had shifted from suspicion to stunned respect. Even Malrek looked unsettled now, his gaze calculating as if he had expected destruction and found something more dangerous control. The records room door opened again, and sound spilled in, voices from the ballroom people gathering in the corridor, drawn by the tremors and the sudden silence. Kalen turned slightly, positioning himself beside Elowen rather than in front of her. It was a subtle choice. He wasn't hiding her. He was standing with her. They stepped out of the records chamber. The hallway beyond was packed with noble servants' guards, faces pale, eyes wide, whispers fluttering like moths. As Elowen appeared, the crowd instinctively began to pull back. But then they saw Kalen at her side, and they stopped, because fear of her fought with fear of him, and fear of him won. Kalen moved forward into the crowd until they reached the edge of the great hall again. The ballroom had not returned to its waltz. The orchestra was silent. The dancers had frozen mid-step. All attention had turned toward the doors. Kaylin walked out first. Elowen followed. She expected the familiar ring of emptiness to open around her. It didn't. Not fully. The crowd held its distance. Yes, but it wasn't the same as before. Before, the distance had been disgust, superstition, rejection. Now it was uncertainty and something else. Recognition. Kaylin stopped in the center of the marble floor, exactly where the dancing had been moments ago. As always, space cleared for him. Silence thickened. He looked across the ballroom, gaze sweeping over faces that had mocked, feared, and ignored Elowen for years. His voice was calm. You called her a curse. No one spoke. You feared her. A few heads lowered, not from shame, but from instinctive submission. Kaylin lifted his hand slightly in invitation, not a command, and Elowen stepped forward until she stood beside him, not behind. He didn't place her at his feet. He placed her at his side. She is the reason you are still alive, Kaylin said. The sentence dropped into the hall like a verdict. Not a plea, not an argument, a truth declared by the only voice powerful enough to force the world to listen. Murmurs rippled outward. She was protecting us. Then the stories, the Thorneville's Lysara stood near her parents, rigid as a statue, her mouth slightly open as if the words had been punched out of her. Lady Seraphine's face had tightened into something unreadable. Her perfect composure cracked at the edges. Lord Velric stared at Elowen with a look that might have been calculation or regret or simple fear of what his choices had created. Elowen felt dozens of gazes on her, some still afraid, some doubtful, some suddenly reverent, as if she were a myth made flesh. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't flinch. Her hands hung at her sides, steady. She realized with a strange quietness that the room hadn't changed. The chandeliers still glittered. The marble still shone. The nobles were still nobles. What had changed was only this. She was no longer shrinking to fit their fear. Elowen looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. She drew a slow breath. I spent my whole life trying not to hurt anyone, she said, and her voice carried farther than she expected, clear, unbroken. The hall held still. Kaylin turned his head slightly toward her eyes, softer now, just for a heartbeat. And you didn't, he said. The words didn't feel like a rescue. They felt like a verdict of a different kind, a declaration that her existence was not a crime. Elowen lifted her gaze to Kaylin. Something had changed in her eyes, too. The old self-doubt, the constant questioning of whether she deserved to breathe near others, had loosened its grip. Not vanished, but loosened. Her voice was quiet but steady. Then I'll stay. Not because she was being kept, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she chose to. Kaylin nodded once. No grand speech, no claim meant for the crowd. He didn't say, I saved you. He didn't say, you're safe now. He simply remained where he was at her side. And for the first time in her life, Elowen Thorneville did not stand in the corner of the story waiting for someone to fall. She stood at the center, not as a curse to be avoided, but as a force that could be understood, held, chosen. The music did not begin again. Not yet, but something else started in the silence. The slow, reluctant turning of a world that had always spun without her. Now it had to spin with her in it. Thank you for staying with Elowen's journey from being feared as a curse to becoming the one who protected everyone. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy stories like this, a like and subscribe truly help us bring more powerful journeys to life. Stay with us for more unforgettable stories where truth changes everything.